Hello, and we're back after having been apparently kicked off because we used a bad word that starts with the letter S to describe something. So we will not be using the S word from now on. We will be using euphemisms, which hopefully will not obfuscate things too much. Although one of the things that we are going to be talking about is the bizarre nature of the obfuscatory language that surrounds all these things. So, um, a little Orwellianism on a Monday evening for you all to enjoy. Um, why don't we restart? And Audrey and Sebastian are going to give the 90-second version of each of their areas of expertise in this. Uh, Audrey, what's going on in New York?
Yeah, so in New York, the Assembly has passed, and the Senate may pass, a bill that would legalize what's called medical aid in dying. It allows terminally ill patients who doctors expect they have less than 6 months to live to request um, lethal medicine that they can take, which will cause their death. It's in many ways based on the law in Oregon. There's a lot of opposition to it, among other reasons, because disabled people are very concerned that a lot of them have the ability to qualify, for example, by refusing forms of treatment, which would then make them terminally ill, and that in general they will sort of have to justify their existence even more than they already do, which is something that many people with disabilities have experience with. So. That's what's going on in New York.
Thank you. And Sebastian, what's going on in the UK?
Yes, so we there's a very similar bill currently going through Britain's lower house, House of Commons. It's now on its third reading, which will the final vote, which will pretty much determine if it becomes law, will happen on the 12th, sorry, the 13th of June on Friday, and it's passed narrowly for the last two readings, so there's a chance it could be blocked still. But the, na- the but it, that it, at the moment it looks likely to become law. So it's very similar. It's supposed to be just for people who are terminally ill. But as Audrey's pointed out, and it's the same in Britain as well, the law's got the same problem, which is it can extend to people who are not actually terminally ill, but who have decided to become so. So a good example of this, they recently voted down, MPs voted down an amendment that would have made it people who are terminally ill because they're refusing to eat because they're anorexic, and now people who are severely mentally ill will be able to kill themselves. Uh, and this whole thing has come about. I was just saying before we got cut off for saying the S word. Um, this whole thing has come about in a very strange circumstances because of a personal promise of our Prime Minister to a minor celebrity who has been very vociferously and somewhat occasionally threateningly campaigning on the issue and writing MPs and accusing them of all sorts of things. So it's all happening in a very surreal atmosphere.
Thank you. Let's try the one thing that I think we should probably try to do is instead of using the K word as well, say unalive themselves, which is something that I have seen Zoomers say, which is really annoying. But again, we're trying to, I guess, be able to discuss this in public in a kind of classical John Stuart Millian way. And it's difficult to do that when you're not allowed to use some of the words because they're considered triggering, rightly. Anyway, that's that is sort of one of the topics of Dr. Eve Slater's recent piece in National Review. Um, Dr. Slater is talking to us as a physician with more than 50 years of experience, and um, uh, but can you describe what the points were that you made in that piece, which I thought was excellent?
Thank you very much, and thank my colleagues for their comments. And yes, the situation is acute both in New York State and in the UK, and actually a number of other states where these types of legislations are being very narrowly passed with very vociferous support that unfortunately distorts a lot of the reality of the situation. I became interested in this when one of our other colleagues, Dr. Lydia Dugdale, who's a colleague of mine, was giving a talk about the effects of these type of things in some of the jurisdictions where it's already been legal, and Canada being the case in point. And as our colleagues have mentioned, patients with um, anorexia in Canada, dementia, loneliness has claimed the lives of almost 4,000 Canadians a year. And so these are treatable conditions. The other point that I think is again lost in the conversation, the proponents will show you a picture of a terribly ill and suffering person, and that of course elicits and ought to elicit tremendous compassion. The problem is that, as my colleagues have already noted, pain turns out not to be the main driver of this procedure. It's more often despair and feeling of abandonment. And as a physician, that is called depression. For the most part, it can be and should be properly treated. And so the tragedy of this type of legislation really is a number of people are really shunted into this by societal pressure. They feel they're a burden. They are not receiving, quite frankly, appropriate medical care. And this is why the disabled are going to be further damaged by these kinds of procedures. Patients, for example, in Canada who can't receive proper palliative care or proper disability care are choosing this as an option. Mm-hmm. And so it's a pretty tragic situation once the genie sort of is let out of the bottle. My colleagues who do palliative care and practice pain management tell me that they do not know of a case where pain cannot be properly managed. And so as a physician, I worry very much about this. And I think it's going to tremendously harm the doctor-patient relationship, because for 2.5 millennia, 2 3/4 millennium, this has been considered unethical by the medical profession, and still is by the AMA, for example. The proponents they don't practice medicine, unfortunately. And I think they have, many of them, this kind of naive, and forgive me if I say these sort of Westchester, that's kind of a very Tony place in New York. They have this kind of they envision a situation where the patient and the doctor have had this long-term relationship, and then the patient develops this perhaps terminal, perhaps not condition. And so they come to this agreement where the doctor can do this and the doctor does it, therefore sort of eliminating perhaps the responsibility of the patient, but that's neither here nor there. And in point of fact, in the practice of medicine, I practice in Manhattan, very few patients have a doctor they call their own anymore, or a doctor who knows them. And I think that's true to the extent that I understand the National Health Service in the UK,
it's
Sebastian,
far worse,
and most other places. So what's going to happen is a doctor who doesn't know the patient is going to be given, here, I have 2 physicians who say I have a terminal illness and I don't need a psychiatric consultation. At least that's how the New York bill reads. And so I'm asking you to prescribe to me a lethal medicine that I'm just going to then take to my house and use when I feel like it. And that's exactly what the New York bill basically enables. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me, and it's really very sad.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is so baffling to me about this is that even the fact that we can't use the word that describes this, and that word has been very carefully essentially expunged from a lot of the language of these bills. And that word describes something that our culture and our civilization has rejected for around 1700 years now, as sort of fundamentally incompatible with the understanding of ethics and the value of human life that that a lot of us, I think, whether or not we belong to a religious tradition, subscribe to. There's something very incoherent about the way that we talk about these deaths, and deaths that, we throw all of our, selves into preventing, that we have foundations to prevent, that we have hotline numbers that we offer people to call because we think that this is not the right choice. Like this is not a choice that honors who we are as people, and that we want to, like, when we hear that someone wants to do this, what we want to do is help them to find a way to live rather than to succeed in doing what they are intending to do. Audrey, I feel like I'd like to know your kind of comments on this. Like, what would you say to someone who is kind of trying to work through this complexity?
Yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, it's again very difficult with not being able to say the words in question, but like it seems like there's basically three stances you can take on the question of people unaliving themselves. One is the stance that it seemed like everyone was taking in my childhood, like, public service announcements. If your friend says they're thinking about this, help them get help, meaning the sort of the it's never a good idea approach, right? This is something we're going to always discourage. We're never going to help people to do this. We're going to always try to discourage them from doing this thing. Um, you could also take a totally radical opposite view of that, which would just say, like, anytime, any reason, if that's what you feel like doing, we will support you to the hilt. Um, I think that's an absolutely nutty approach to take, because it means someone who has drunk too much alcohol, and has a bad idea, you just have to say, you do you. Or, I mean, yes, I mean, all everything from that on down. Um, and I think people who support this bill are envisioning kind of like a mature intermediate solution, which is like, no, 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 only in the cases where this is a legitimate choice. Um, and that sort of creates a really puzzling question, which is, okay, like why in general are we against this? And then what would it mean for it to be a sort of a legitimate choice? Um, and I think there's like basically sort of two sets of reasons that we normally think it's not a legitimate choice. Um, One of which involves just sort of an unconditional opposition to it. Like, human life is sacred. This person has value, even if, like, I mean, again, it's particularly acute, of course, if you're thinking of someone in your own life, right? Like, this friend of mine, they don't perceive that their life is valuable, but I perceive their life as valuable. Um, and so, like, and this would be a bad thing for them to be gone, right? So if you're in that camp, though, you're already kind of in the camp of we should always oppose this. I think the other reason that's also widely shared for people discouraging other people from unaliving themselves, is the idea that that's actually not sort of the authentic, deep desire of the person who wants to do that. Um, that when you're depressed, for example, desires that you might have in that direction are that's not really what you want. That is your depression sort of taking charge of you. And especially the experience of people who sort of come in and out of depressive states is pretty consonant with that. It's like, oh, like I had people will say, oh, I had this period when this thing seemed attractive to me, and thank goodness that I didn't go through with that. Or I tried to do this and then someone stopped me, and that was really good. I think that's a very typical experience for people who have those desires or attempted that. Um, and so then if that's kind of if that's like the main reason we're trying to stop people, or discourage them from doing this, and certainly like refusing to participate in facilitating that activity, um, I think what you end up having to do is you need to say, okay, well, you know, in most cases, of course, that's not your authentic desire because you lead a good life. You lead a valuable life. Your life is a real contribution. But of course, if you're in this kind of like, if you're one of these people who fall into wherever you draw the line, oh, if you only have less than 6 months, um, on the one hand, you end up drawing a line where you say, you know, you've put those people in the box, which is like your lives, it's rational to view your own life as not worth living, unlike everyone else, which is itself kind of, yeah, I think actually just totally unjustifiable and unjustified, among other reasons, because like why wouldn't depression be a reason for people in that circumstance to feel that way? Um, yeah, cut me off if I carry on for too long about this, but another issue is that sometimes people they have sort of a more objective or external stance about what they would want. Like, oh, okay, well, if I'm in these circumstances, I want to be kept alive. I'm kind of basically young and healthy, but if I'm ever in those circumstances, this is what I would want. And so like, oh, well, it's the healthy person's desire for this. Um, but those desires themselves can be quite suspect. I mean, we've all heard stories of people who've been very prosperous, who've like lost their money, but they're not, or maybe they're going to jail for a year or two, but like their life is, quote, ruined per their own standards. But per the standards of most people, like they might still totally have a way to make a living. Um, and these people often actually do sort of successfully unalive themselves in those circumstances, because evidently they actually had this belief that a life where you're not earning $1 million a year is a life not worth living, or whatever, which is clearly something we have to say, no, that's actually crazy. So, but it's not really clear to me why, if we want to say like, oh, no, it's fine, the life of someone earning, the life of the middle class person is a life of dignity, and when the finance billionaire has their fall from grace, their unaliving is not a good choice. Um, why do we feel comfortable saying that about people who are going from the condition of being healthy, basically to the condition of being disabled? Like, oh, well, if I'm in a wheelchair and I'm not able to control my faculties, or other people have to take care of me, or I'm inconvenient. Well, of course, that's the life I would choose to reject in my own case. Like, how can we support that and still say we value the lives of of course, that's a good reason that you would want to unalive yourself. And then still like really, really support people with disabilities. Yeah, so those are some concerns. And I guess I would also just add the concern with criteria is like, I mean, yeah, I don't think we should be having this stuff anyways, but it's like, if you allow this based on being terminally ill, it's not clear to me why you shouldn't allow it to people who are chronically ill who choose to refrain from treatment, because I think patients actually should have the right. I think a diabetic should have the right. Actually, I think pretty much anyone, especially anyone who doesn't have serious mental illness, we should have the right to refuse medical treatment if we don't want it. Um, so then there's a question, okay, so now the diabetic who has depression suddenly is eligible for this. And so then we're extending it basically to many people just on the basis of physical pain. And then are we not going to extend it to people on the basis of mental anguish, which is also very real, whether or not it's diagnosable? And so I think, yeah, so an additional concern is that if you start at that intermediate point, you either sort of draw some very arbitrary lines that end up sort of wronging people on both sides of them, and you also in practice are going to just slip right down that slope to like, we just offer it to anyone who wants it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Audrey. Dr. Slater, you talked about the sort of way in which this is actually going to be, it is not going to be the story of the Westchester, like very well educated at the same level as his or her doctor, person who has, after um, deeply kind of reflecting on his or her values, decided this in consultation with his or her trusted physician of many years. But instead, this is going to be something that, as a norm, as a new social norm, puts pressure on the people who are the most vulnerable. And that the physician-patient relationship will be, which is meant to be one that protects people when they are extremely vulnerable and when they do need help, and which is meant to be a kind of relationship of healing. Like that is the nature of a doctor's task. That's going to be challenged and subverted. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I will, before answering or trying to address the point you've just raised, I will make a point relative to what Audrey just said. Most physicians, myself included, do not know and cannot predict that people have 6 months to live. People have tried to study this, and we get it right about maybe less than half the time. And I've been thankfully proved wrong on many occasions. So there's already, I think, a a fallacy in the premise that you qualify if you have less than 6 months to live, because any doctor who declares that is not is assuming a crystal ball that they absolutely don't have. A problem relative to your point, Susanna, is the fact of time. My understanding actually is that you get 11 minutes with the last statistic I saw is you get 11 minutes with your primary care physician in the UK. The US does, these are interesting stats. The US does a little better. You get 20 minutes with me as a primary care doc. And I could reschedule you for another 20 minutes. But so the question is, how are we going to have these kind of discussions when medical care is being driven, in some cases by corporate pressures, in other cases by lack of enough physicians, access, et cetera, et cetera? How are we going to be able to have relevant life-meaning conversations to establish where a patient really is, how much depression they may or may not have, how quotes unquote long they may need to live when we do 20-minute interviews, or 11 minutes in the UK and less than that in some other. I mean, I think some of your listeners are probably from other jurisdictions, but the patient physician-patient relationship is being assaulted by many pressures, many of them economic, and putting a legalization of unaliving oneself into this mix. And it's been shown now in Canada, the Netherlands, everywhere else. This is going to be a time saver.
Yeah, and a money saver. Sebastian, one of the things that I've been really struck by, and which struck me again today, after I read a recent New York Times piece about a woman who sought MAiD successfully in Canada, is just this sense that we have, or that is kind of a common, that has to be the case if any of this is going to make sense, but it doesn't seem to be the case at all, which is that there is this thing that is our autonomous self, which has a kind of pure desire to die, which is not crazy, and is not and is legitimate, and is also not subject to the pressure of there being a law that says it is okay for you to ask for this, and is also not subject to the pressure of, since there is a law, perhaps your family are like putting their thumb on the scales and being like, actually, this is a real schlep. Your long process of being old is a schlep for us, and we really kind of would prefer to get on with our lives. Like that is such a familiar and such an awful thing, that the whole idea of autonomy within that, as though it were the case, or should be the case, that humans don't respond to the sense that like their loved ones don't want them around, or the law says that their lives aren't valuable. Like that just seems crazy to me. I apparently started ranting about this while trying to ask you a question, but Sebastian, help me here. Am I crazy?
No, no, you're not at all. And I think actually Audrey touched on a really good point when she was talking about all of these people who think they're going to do one thing, in some abstract scenario, and they objectively their life is not that bad. Like they're still relatively healthy and they have their faculties, and okay, maybe they have a mind, they have like a disability or now or something, but it's something that a lot of people would think were negotiable, but because it's worse than what they used to have, people suddenly think, I can't deal with this. And of course they change their minds. And I think what we're kind of realizing is that thing about autonomy you said. What happens when the modern world just tries to remove something that's natural and basic to who we are, is it takes its horrible revenge. And I think what we're discovering with this issue is the revenge of the social. You know, because there's a history to the S word that is not the liberal history, because it has existed in human societies across time. And if you go back to, the societies where it was a big factor, honor-based societies like, feudal Japan or classical Rome or Greece, people, unalived themselves, moving forward to say, um, not because necessarily they had chosen it for themselves, but because they had died a social death. Their reputation had been ruined. They'd lent some money to somebody and sorry, someone had lent them some money and they couldn't pay them back. Well, one way to rescue yourself from the situation, or you faced enslavement. That is a loss of social status. You might still have a comfortable life at the end of it, but because you didn't have your public reputation and honor, you're in a sense, society had proclaimed that you were in a sense dead. And that's the horrible thing that can happen that we're not thinking about because human beings aren't autonomous. And in fact, the main reason people tend to unalive themselves is almost always because, in some sense, they feel they can't exist socially anymore. That might be because they can't do things that they consider core to their identity anymore. It might be because they don't think they're valued anymore, because they don't think they're needed by their friends and family, because they think they're a burden on them. And this isn't just people who you might say are, in a cruel sense, objectively a burden because there's some financial or care burden. This includes depressed teenagers who think that who just see everything through a dark lens and they think my friends don't really like me, my family don't really love me. That's what people think. And what we're sort of facilitating here, and this was something that I think Eve brought out very powerfully, is with removing, doctors are people who are present at tragedies. They're supposed to be people who help people through tragedies, but we're putting them in a situation where I'm not saying they will, but they can inflict tragedy. And I don't think we quite realize how horrific that can look like. So, just to give a real world example of what that can mean, is let's not even look at the hard case. Let's not look at the example where you've got imperfect consent or where someone's pressuring someone into it. Because, I mean, by the way, that has happened. And we've got recorded cases of it. But if you look at a situation from the Low Countries, there was a case of a mother who decided to take assisted dying, and she didn't tell her children, who very much wanted her still to be alive and around. And um, doctors knew about this, the state knew about it, several doctors knew about it, but they just won't. And the point is, it happens every day that people wake up and they get them horrible phone call that says, someone has been in an accident, someone has God forbid, has been in a shooting. But what if we live in a world in which someone picks up the phone and they say, um, a doctor has given a lethal dose to someone that you love, and they didn't tell you about it. And this isn't, as horrible as people, the S word can be. There's an additional horror now, which is that somebody knew about this. Someone knew it was going to happen. They knew that you weren't being told about it, and legally they couldn't tell you.
Mhm.
And I think we all intuitively know that that's unjust and that that's cruel. But we've settled up to a series of philosophical beliefs about what human beings are that mean we can't that this intuition, this thing that interpersonally we know to be wrong, lying, removing yourself from people, not giving people the chance to say goodbye, things that we know are wrong, we are now not only legally facilitating, but we're making into a kind of human right, a kind of secular sacrament. And I don't have words. It's
Yeah,
just it's wrong.
yeah. To the audience, we actually lost a bunch of your questions when we were booted earlier. So if you have questions that you'd like me to ask, we're going to go into that in a little bit after I ask, I think probably one more question. But if you have questions that you'd like me to read aloud and for our panelists, just drop them in the chat on YouTube. So I guess, Audrey, the one thing that I'd like to hear from you, because it seems like one of the things that we kind of need to reckon with, if we're going to reckon with this, is we've this practice we all seem to be fairly decided about is a bad death. So what does and it's a bad death while attempting to be a particularly good death. Um, what is the nature of a good death? What's the nature of, like, obviously, well, not obviously, what is the nature of death? What's the nature of a good death? How can you do it well? And how can we like recover the idea that dying well is a really important thing that you do, not like a sort of it's one of the challenges and crucial things that we can do for ourselves and each other, and not dying badly, not dying uh, by going AWOL seems to me to be something that's pretty crucial in that.
Yeah, well, I've not died myself, so I can't say I'm sort of a first-hand expert, but I have seen some people die very well. Um, and yeah, I mean, one of the things that death focally involves is the loss of um, control. It's something you undergo, and not necessarily in a way that you're going to be able to plan out or predict. Obviously, in a sort of a really striking case would just be, an accident or something. That's not something that you planned, as getting in a car accident or something like that. Um, but there, I guess, two thoughts I have. One is that I think it would be really valuable to reclaim sort of a narrative and uh, traditions around all the good that dying people can do for their communities. Dr. Lydia Dugdale, who I know Dr. Slater knows very well, wrote this book about the lost art of dying. And one of the things she talks about is how this idea, which I think started, well, I don't remember the exact history, but it's been going on for a long time. And I think it was particularly popular during the plague in Europe. But there was an idea that the person who is dying is they're sort of the star performer in a play. And all the people who are assisting at their death are the understudies, because that's a role that we're each going to take on someday. And it's been, I mean, in my life, there's two deaths in particular that it was a great privilege to be connected to. And both of those people, and one in particular, I'm like, that is what I want to do. And I mean, it was just like a privilege to see that, and to say, like, and yeah, and a gift of that person to me to allow me to be close to them while they were dying or approaching death. And so I think if we can kind of rescue that idea a little bit, that gives people, and whether or not it ends up being a consolation to them, it gives people as they approach death, um, a sense of purpose and mission, which is to pave the way for, yeah, is to share something really, really valuable with the people who love them and are taking care of them. I mean, a lot of other things too, like getting to be with them itself, but also just, yeah, like showing them how it's done. Yeah, and like more prosaically, I mean, we can also talk more about palliative care options, because um, there's, yeah, it's like medicine has a very legitimate role in providing pain relief as people approach death. And the amount of pain relief that can be legitimate to provide is like, can be quite a lot more. Like if I got in a car accident and I like broke my leg really badly, I mean, they should do what they can on the pain relief front, but I can imagine there being a scenario where they just say, okay, you have to accept some kind of pain that, because you're going to get better. It's just your leg that's broken. But if I were hit by a car in a worse way, God forbid, and I was dying, it can make sense to offer someone more pain relief, because you don't have to think about the long-term health consequences in the same way. So I think that's also that is also something we can give people as they approach. Again, I'm not a physician, so Dr. Slater might have more to say to that. But
Well, I just wanted to make the point, because I think you've raised a topic we haven't covered completely. The proponents of this sort of thing, wherever they may be, in the UK or in New York or wherever, they kind of make their case by promulgating this tremendous fear of death. And death is scary. And of course, those of you not in the medical profession don't see it that often. And we have seen it more often as doctors. We're trained, hopefully, to be able to help patients through end of life. But I can tell you again, with 50 years of experience in the practice of medicine, it's of course, it's a scary thing for each of us to contemplate for ourselves, by all means, but death can be managed without the kind of fear that is engendered by these proponents who almost use the threat of fear to force legislators in particular into thinking that this is a better alternative. I've managed and witnessed any number of deaths, and I can tell you that they can be peaceful and they can be not quite as scary as one is led to believe.
I mean, we haven't really majored on this in this call, but we are a Christian magazine. And one of the things that, as Dr. Slater was talking, I was thinking about was the idea that Christ sets us free from the fear of death and the kind of enslavement of the fear of death, which has certainly been my experience of not growing up Christian and then becoming Christian. You do think about death a whole lot differently because you have new information. So that is something that, you know, for those for whom that resonates, let it resonate. We have a question from the audience, which I thought was a really good one, is laws form characters in big ways if the last decades indicate anything. I worry that it'll be harder for us all to imagine human dignity, presumably in a legal culture where it is legal to kill people, or for one to choose to unalive oneself. How should we think about culture as downstream of politics and of law in this way? Sebastian, do you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just to extend what I was saying earlier about we're getting back, we're looking at a situation where we've got all this law that's framed on the assumption that people will be radically self-determining. And I do think there is, I mean, I think other people have alluded to it, an element of sort of class privilege here as well, because some people live lives which, because they have a lot of resources, their personal decisions are relatively autonomous. But an awful lot of people, they're dependent on the help of friends and relatives to get by, even as healthy, able-bodied people, let alone if they become disabled or ill. And, you know, you can I mean, I was going to say what you can imagine. I think we're already beginning to see in places where they've brought these kind of laws in, people who are poorer, disabled, who are addicted to drugs, they can die social deaths, and those social deaths can become very permanent in a situation where the state can apply these drugs. And, you know, doctors suddenly are being put in the position of having to adjudicate the value of lives. And once they start doing that, you know, without even intending to, in some cases, they will make judgments which are going to correlate with race and class because, well, this person seems to be in a worse situation. They seem to be unhappier, and but you know you'll see who is going to fall into the category of having a life that's not worth living, and the people who'll be making that determination are also going to be from a very different background generally from the people who are going to be receiving this so-called treatment. And so I think that's sort of that's those are the kinds of processes I think we're already starting to see.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Canada. What are the ways that we in Canada can inform these debates in other jurisdictions? So that's basically, I guess, a kind of question about what's been going on in Canada. And I kind of regard it as you know, yeah, there is a slippery slope. So does anyone want to talk about what has been going on in Canada and how that can help us to think about what we would like for our jurisdictions? Any of you?
Well, the Canadians publish very clear data. The Canadian data, by the way, are quite a lot better than the data coming from the US states. One of the main reasons, unfortunately, we have less good public health records. Number one, and number two, the death certificates must read the underlying illness by legal definition in the law. So you can't say what happened. So that makes it a lot harder to track in the US when the procedures are being done. According to the Canadian report that came out summarizing the year 2024 last year, a total of 60,000 Canadians have died since legalization, medical assisted dying. It's 99+% by euthanasia, which is direct injection by a doctor, or actually non-doctors can do it in Canada also. So, and in some US laws, that's becoming the case. So you don't even have to be a physician. You have to have some medical credentials, but not that many. So 4.7% of deaths in Canada now occur by euthanasia. But percentages as high as in the teens percentage in some of the provinces, Quebec province being the highest. I think it's up to 15 or 16% in Quebec province. It's low in the British Columbia Western provinces. And it is legal in Canada for dementia with an advance directive. And it is about to become legal for mental illness. However, it is legal for mental illness, not about to be, sorry, I kind of misspoke. It is legal, however, the government put a hold on it for enforcement or enactment until 2027.
Right.
Because they didn't want to have to deal with the volume.
Right. It's
So that's just a quick once over in Canada. I think I already mentioned 3,300 in 1 year for loneliness, about 430 people for lack of disability services in 1 year. These are data from the last annual report. Another 400 or so for lack of access to proper palliative care. Those are just top of mind statistics from Canada. And those Canadians who feel that they don't want to live under these circumstances, it's very hard to reverse a law once it's been passed and then expanded as it has in Canada.
So those are the cases where it's sort of like, well, we don't have access right now to a wheelchair ramp for your house, but we can offer you,
Yeah, they're anecdotal reports.
Yeah.
There's some very active websites that I imagine that your readers and
Yeah.
listeners can access that detail some of this stuff. But there's a tremendous, and there are many actually advocates in Canada, especially from the Veterans Affairs community. There's some very, very outspoken advocates because veterans are now having this recommended to them, or people are going in for cancer surgery and it's being mentioned. Have you thought of this as an alternative? There are anecdotal reports all over the place in the lay literature of this option being suggested to a lot of people who hardly qualify, if at all.
Yeah. We have one more question that I want to ask. Maybe more, but we'll see. Audrey, this is, I think, it's a good one for you. How would we justify opposition to MAiD or that sort of thing in general outside a religious context? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very possible. There's like so many directions. One is kind of like the question of like how seriously do you want to take your your efforts to, I keep forgetting what euphemism were you unaliving yourself?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one is sort of like what I was talking about earlier with like um if you think that's important at all, it's not really clear. Like if you're committed to not having people do that in the sort of the most kind of classic cases when you think of that kind of thing happening, something socially bad happens to them and they feel despair or they're suffering from depression. Why it is that we would assume that people in different circumstances would have desires that are sort of that their desires are in fact legitimate. I think kind of one interesting thought experiment you can do there would be like, okay, let's imagine that medicine really improves, and then in like a couple hundred years, nobody in society ever experiences sort of like the little setbacks and aches and pains that like sort of a normal, pretty healthy person would experience. And they kind of become sensitized, and they're like, that life would not be worth living. And so, this is an approach you can take to like, oh, I stubbed my toe, to use the silliest example. But so like if we're not going to say no in all cases, we're not going to do this. Um, are we going to just base it on subjective desire? Because that's basically in practice going to allow it all the time. Or are we going to choose some kind of objective standard? And like, if so, where are we going to stand to make that assessment? Because I mean, if I suffer from a bout of depression, I don't want someone to say, well, you live in the world where people get hangnails or what, that makes sense that you would want to die in such a world. I think those are sort of the more theoretical reasons. I think the more practical reasons would just be um, like what does it mean to think about exiting, or telling people it's fine for them to exit in conditions like Sebastian was talking about, of which are normally involve mutual dependence, and when they don't, that's kind of like a failure. So like if I have young children, for example, I think most people would think it would be sort of monstrous of me, without kind of like a really good reason, to just leave, right? To just take off and like, I'm gonna go live my life and I'm just gonna leave them. I want to do something else. And so the question, okay, so maybe you might think, okay, so for people like that, people who are kind of embedded in some way, we're gonna sort of, at least gently at some level, oppose unaliving themselves, refuse to celebrate it, refuse to do it ourselves. But then again, what this creates is sort of like a meritocracy of belonging, where we're gonna say, oh yeah, people who have sort of been fortunate enough to find themselves in a situation where other people rely on them and value them, um, they're the ones we don't want to unalive themselves, and the other people are disposable. So um, I, I think most of the advocates of this tend to be kind of powerful people who kind of have felt in control for most of their life. But in practice, what will happen if this stuff gets allowed is that it will involve us viewing people who are less embedded and less able as being disposable. Um, and so if you're not comfortable with that,
Mhm.
uh, it's really unclear, like how we can be. I mean, and it can get as dark as you want. Oh, just like, what about poor people, right? Like, poverty is a source of suffering. Are we just gonna say, if you're poor and you're a teenager and you're like in a life circumstance where your chances of becoming, like, you live in a rough neighborhood, you're not going to a good school, rough family circumstances, like, if you're depressed, can you just say, I want out? And we're going to say, like, yeah, you're 16, or wait till you're 18, right? It's like, you're right. Your circumstances are bad. I mean, yeah, that's just like the most horrifying way to let society off the hook for the other people around us. Um, yeah, so those would be some of my non-religious concerns.
I was actually kind of thinking earlier in the day, and we're gonna probably have to wrap up with this. But I was actually thinking earlier in the day about the very many people who, when I've, tweeted about this or like had conversations about this, who've said things like, I'm so glad that this was not available when I was, 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I was thinking about doing this. Because I'm so grateful for my life now. And I got through that period of time when I had that impulse. And I, it just occurs to me that like people who choose in the face of suffering, whether it's psychological or physical, um, and in the face of temptations towards that, to in fact like make choices towards their own flourishing and make choices towards hope, and to not do that. I feel like we should regard those people as heroes. Like that's a kind of magnanimity, a kind of great souledness that I think, I know that my life is better and more secure because there are people out there who've chosen not to do that. I know that my life is richer because for each person who chooses not to do that, my life is richer. And just, I think, we desperately need to be needed, as well as needing, others. And I think that one of the things that people who are, tempted by these ideas need to hear is that, like, the rest of society, the rest of us need them to stick it out for our sakes as a gift to us, because that kind of great souledness, that kind of magnanimity makes the world a better place for all of us. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This was really last minute, and we don't really do that many kind of political calls to action here, so we're not going to do that, but just think in your heads about what you'd like to do. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to the three of you and to Alan and to all of you guys who are listening to this and who stuck with us through the weird incident earlier. And I think we managed to not get kicked off again, which I love for us. All right, so bye everyone, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.